G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here, and I'm here to talk to you about what happens next for the community of Central Coast. Sadly, the community of Central Coast found themselves in financial administration towards the end of last year. The community had been previously forced into an amalgamation, and as a direct or indirect result of that, they found themselves unable to pay their staff. The question is, what do we do now? Thank you. So the first thing is that people inevitably being people, they want to cast blame. And most of the blame has been cast at the councillors that were running the show at the time. However, the GM and the CFO also lost their job, I understand. Now, I'm not entirely sure that it's reasonable to blame the councillors for what's actually happened here. I think there's an awful lot of other parties that deserve to shoulder at least a bit of the blame. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against public hangings to hold people to account for their failures, but as you will see, I'm not at all certain we've got the right people here. So these two notes from financial statements are very, very important. This first note here is from 2019. All I've done is a copy and a paste, okay? And in 2019, in the audited financial statements, the unrestricted cash is clearly written as $51 million. These are in thousands of dollars. Now, let's fast forward to note the same note. It's got a different number now from the 2020 audited financial statements. And that 2019 figure for unrestricted cash has all of a sudden been restated to minus negative 43 million. So in 2019, the audited financial statements were telling the councillors who were using these statements as the basis for making decisions about the future budget that they had $51 million of free money in the bank. Along comes audited financial statements a year later, after the council's been put into financial administration, and we're now being told, oops, that $51 million wasn't really $51 million, it was minus $43 million. Now, obviously, that would make a big difference to the decisions that the councillors would have been making if they had the correct figure back in 2019. So this error is very important because all these errors appeared on the audited financial statements. And in fact, there's 3 lots of audited financial statements that were all subject to the same error, having the incorrect amount stated as an unrestricted cash for 3 years concurrently. Now, this is really interesting because the New South Wales State Government has recently mandated that the Auditor General's Department of New South Wales would be the sole provider of audit services. Now, this is a copy and paste from the 2019 audited financial statements, and it says, this is the auditor's report, and it says the council's accounting records are being kept in accordance with the requirements of the Local Government Act. They are presented fairly in all material respects. What does materiality mean? In accounting and auditing terms, something is material if it would change your decision making if you knew differently. Now, I can assure you that if the councillors had known they actually had negative $43 million in the bank, that would have changed their decisions. They were under the impression they had almost $51 million in the bank. And the financial position is a correct reflection of the financial position of the council. There's no material, there's that materiality word again, no material deficiencies that have come to light during the audit. Now, I was an internal auditor for a major bank at one stage, and I understand how the audit process works. In fact, I've taught auditing. I understand that you don't check everything. I understand that Australian auditing standards talk about reasonable assurance. However, there were 3 audits that failed to pick up this major mistake, which led to the collapse of the council. 3 audits, not 1, 3 audits by the New South Wales Auditor General. And I think we need to ask some questions about the quality of the audit process. And there's no doubt at all the Auditor General has their part of the blame to account for. Interestingly, also, the Auditor General is responsible for monitoring the financial sustainability of New South Wales local governments and reporting to the Minister on that. And as far as I'm aware, they hadn't reported to the Minister that collapse was imminent prior to it being too late to do anything. So there's a little bit of blame here, and it can't all be laid at the feet of the councillors. You know, you've got to remember your typical councillor might be an English teacher, might be a business owner, might be just a retired person. It could be anyone. It's unlikely to be a qualified accountant, an auditor. Now, if they're reading financial statements that have been audited by no less than the Auditor General of New South Wales, and they're seeing a figure on that statement, it's not unreasonable that they accept the figure at face value and make decisions and judgments according to what they're reading. I'm really struggling to find out how we can hold them accountable for making bad decisions based on bad information that they were given that was poorly audited and poorly prepared even prior to the auditing phase. It's a really interesting scenario. But there's more blame to cast around, because the fact of the matter is that this council was in a forced amalgamation. And if you've watched my other videos, you know that the average outcome for forced amalgamated councils was an increase to expenditure in the order of about 11% per annum. And as it turns out, consistent with just about all the New South Wales amalgamations, you can clearly see that employee costs did go up as a result of amalgamation. They went up substantially. In fact, if you compare the last full financial year, 2015, before amalgamation, to the first full financial year after amalgamation, the costs have gone up 11.8%. Now, that's actually not bad when you compare it to the state average. The state average was just over 15%. But clearly there was an increase in staff costs. And once again, if you look at total expenditure, compare that last full financial year to the first full financial year after amalgamation. These years in between, they're no good to look at. 2016 was cut short by a month and a bit. 2017 was a month and a bit too big. So let's compare full financial years, and you can see expenditure went up 18%. Now that's a bit worse than what happened on average for the state. On average for the state was just over 11%. So as much as some parties would like to pretend that amalgamation had nothing to do with this, amalgamation clearly played a part. Now, was it the whole reason why the council went broke? No. As I've outlined, there was audit failure. No doubt the councillors did make some mistakes. Certainly it seems that the CFO and GM made some mistakes. But so did everyone involved in these disastrous amalgamations. The Independent Local Government Review Panel, chaired by Mr. Sampson. We had KPMG, we had IPART involved, we had Ernst & Young doing work for IPART. They all predicted we were going to have savings, and what's actually happened is we've got a lot of extra expense. Clearly, if you're going to have extra expense in the order of 18% and your revenue doesn't go up 18%, your financial sustainability is going to diminish, and you're going to be in a crisis point. And as it turns out, we see from the last lot of IPART rate increases, special rate variations, that there's a number of amalgamated councils that had huge double-digit rate increases approved by IPART to cover the costs of these amalgamations, the additional costs that have come on board because of the amalgamations, and there will be even more next year. And clearly, Central Coast was one of those councils. Their revenue was capped by legislation, their expenses went up. It certainly contributed to the mess they find themselves in now. And once again, I'm so sad for these communities. That's why I went to Central Coast to talk to the community, because they deserve the truth. They deserve some unbiased, independent advice. And frankly, they deserve better than what they've had for many years, all these amalgamated communities. So what do we do now? Well, the important thing to recognise is that an administrator has no silver bullet. He doesn't have any different levers, and it will be a he because it's always the same old bloke club. He doesn't have any different levers to what the council would have to get out of the financial mess. The difference is he actually had audited financial statements that told him the correct facts, rather than the audited financial statements that the councillors were dealing with, which were incorrect, which should have been picked up on at least one of those 3 audits. So you can have fire sales of assets. You can sell land and building, council buildings, and plant and equipment. That's all been done. You can reduce expenditure. Yes, you can. You can sack some people, and he's done that. But presumably these people had something to do. You sack people is going to require other people to pick up the slack. It's going to result in reduced service standards. So there's a cost associated with reducing expenditure. There's fiction that a lot of people have in their heads that councils are just sitting there wasting heaps of money for no particular reason. There is always a reason a person is employed. Sometimes the reasons aren't good enough to justify the employment, but there was always a reason. Everyone that was employed there was doing something. They weren't twiddling their thumb all day. Now there's less people there, so there's going to be consequences to that. You're going to have to increase the fees significantly, and that would have been reflected in the operational plan. And there'll be increases to tax. Now, I note there's a temporary increase, but when you look at the permanent increases that other councils have been putting in, 20%, 37%, 53% other amalgamated councils, and they're all permanent increases, you've got to wonder whether a 15% temporary increase for 3 years is going to cut it. I don't think it will, but I haven't had full access to the council's book, so I can't tell you for sure. And generally the way we solve a lot of these amalgamations through a backdoor bailout, we manipulate the intergovernmental grants, increase the grants, which helps put the council back in a viable fiscal condition, but that comes at the cost of all the other local governments, because there's only a set bucket of money to be divvying up. If you give more to some councils to bail them out, means other councils get less, and unfortunately you can have this domino knock-on effect, and that's something to be very concerned about. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you know I've got a lot of concerns about administration. I've got problems with the incentives for the administrator to get the council out of administration. I can't see where their incentive is there. I've got troubles with too much power and competence being invested in one person. Very little transparency, no political accountability, and very little accountability full stop. I've got problems with the fact that the councillors aren't involved and they're not learning. I've got problems with the fact that we've suspended democracy, and we're always banging on about how wonderful it is to live in a free democracy. And I've got problems with natural justice, because we're going to hang these councillors, and lots of effort has already been put into publicly executing these councillors. And hey, I'm all for a public execution, but can we please make sure we get the people who are actually responsible for this mess, and everyone that deserves some blame gets captured in the process if we're going to hang people out to dry. So there are alternatives to administration, and I covered this in a separate video. It's a mentor model. You know, what's the end game? What does a minister really want from administration? They want to know that the problem's not getting worse. They want to know before something stupid gets done that they'll ultimately have to pick up the tab for. Well, a mentor achieves exactly that. You have your councillors in place. The mentor's at every meeting. The mentor's constantly talking to the councillors. The mentor knows exactly what the councillors are doing. If it's a good mentor, they're advising them well, and the councillors would be stupid not to take their advice. And the mentor has a direct line to the minister. If things start going south, he can go to the minister and she can intervene. It achieves the same thing. But the difference with the mentor model is you preserve democracy. The councillors are still there. They're learning how to deal with this problem, so that we have the skills when we finally revert back to democracy. We have a skilled pool of people who have learned something, who can use those lessons to manage the council's finances better in the future. It's a much better proposition, and please watch that video if you haven't already done so. The other question that comes to mind is, well, is de-amalgamation an option? Well, yes it is. We're the de-amalgamation capital of the world, mainly because we're the stuffed up amalgamation capital of the world. There's been 5 in Australia so far successfully. One in particular is interesting, Deloitte in 2002. And it's interesting because Victoria, unlike the other states, actually does a citizen satisfaction survey every year. So we can compare the outcomes prior to de-amalgamation with after de-amalgamation. You can see here, prior to de-amalgamation, citizen satisfaction 55, 58, the average at the time was 65%. People weren't happy. After de-amalgamation, satisfaction goes up significantly. More so at Mansfield, that's a community that really wanted to break away. Benalla was really ambivalent about the whole thing of de-amalgamation, but still, they're more satisfied. The year after, even more satisfied. Notice the average for the state hasn't moved. So what this tells us, the year after that, obviously local political debates and influence was starting to influence those results. What this tells us is that yes, you can do amalgamation, and yes, as far as 2 years afterwards, people were much happier after they've been de-amalgamated. So yes, it's possible. There's just no two ways about that. What's the cost? I'll be doing up a separate video for this later, but here's some example of costs. I did the estimate for Cootamundra-Gundagai Regional Council, 1.75 million, and I'd do it for less than that, in fact. Delatite in today's money was about 1.6 million. The 4 de-amalgamations in Queensland a few years ago, Douglas Shire 3.2, Livingstone 6.98, Mareeba 4.9, Noosa 4.4 million. It's expensive, it's very expensive. But compare it to the additional costs that this council's incurring, I think you'll find it's probably good value for money, depending how quickly we can capture those diseconomies of scale and reverse them. So there's these one-off costs. There's also some ongoing costs. Obviously, you'll need an additional GM and additional CFO because you'll have 2 councils. You'll have 2 audit committees, more costs there. 2 lots of auditor fees, and incidentally, when we went to the New South Wales Auditor General, the fees went up tremendously by about 120 grand for this council. Now we'll have 2 lots. Now I'm not sure that we got extra value for those extra fees, and it seems like there's been a huge audit failure here, but it is a significant cost that we've got to think about. Now I must emphasise here, those de-amalgamation costs we've looked at in other councils, you can't estimate the de-amalgamation costs for Central Coast based on what's happened previously. You need to do this properly. Guess and giggles what got us in most of these messes for amalgamated councils in the first place. You need to go and get actual invoices, work out which precise staff jobs would go, when they're likely to retire, what equipment will have to be bought, particularly in view of the recent fire sale that we've had. It's a big job. It's about a month's work to work it out precisely, and that's what needs to be done before you do the next step. But against those costs, you've got the potential for ongoing savings, clawing back some of those diseconomies of scale. Now, if you even got back the average diseconomies of scale over time, that's about $60 million. Now, you won't get it back all straight away. You'll be lucky if you can claw back a quarter in the first couple of years. But over time, as people retire and we don't replace their positions, we will capture some of and most of those diseconomies of scale. So as a financial proposition, de-amalgamation is a real option. There are other options too, which I went through in the community presentation. I understand they're probably going to put it up on the web. So the community has options. They need to get involved. They need to be engaged, because that's what got us to the mess, which is a lot of people aren't engaged. And when people aren't engaged, they can't put their views forward, and those views aren't taken into account. So please get engaged, go and get as much independent expert advice as possible, not people who are merely calling themselves experts, real experts that know what they're talking about, people who aren't doing it to earn money, and make some good decisions. But it's not a good situation. Someone's got to pay for this, and it will mean extra fees, extra taxes, lower service levels, people losing their jobs. It's a terrible position, and that's why I get so cranky about these self-professed experts running around that get us in these messes in the first place, because at the end of the day, when a local government fails, people suffer, and a whole heap of people in Central Coast are about to suffer, and that's really, really sad. But let's put the blame where it belongs. Let's all accept the part that we played in it. And then let's start thinking about the best way forward for people, and start thinking about people, not the institution. That's the key thing. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.